So prior to 1764, the East India Company was the sort of the British conglomerate, right? Britain's conglomerate that came to India. So they would bring gold and silver. They would pay for that. So gold and silver was used to pay for Indian goods from Indian producers. And these Indian goods went to Britain, okay? And these goods that went to Britain used to obviously for their economy there. They used to also trade those goods with other countries to buy all sorts of things, lumber. In fact, they used to fund from the capital they got for that, they could fund various activities. But remember, I just want you to look at this box here. They used to pay for this with gold and silver. So at this point, the trade was fair pre-1764. Indians produced stuff. They made Indian goods. Britain got the goods and the East India Company traded in gold and silver. Okay. Now in 1764, the East India Company started moving towards being, remember, the East India Company, the French, the Dutch, they all had their little companies and they would actually fight against each other. And in the Battle of Buxar, Britain actually won a piece. They had got some leverage, and using that leverage, they were able to get tax revenue. This is again 1764. Remember, they're collecting taxes in the United States. There, people started rebelling. But in India, they started, after that battle, they moved into a taxation force. So here you see, after 1764, the East India Company, from Indian producers, the Indians, they collect taxes, collect quite a bit of taxes. And this tax revenue in rupees stays in India. And then they use these tax rupees, that's the Indian currency, to buy Indian goods. Notice there's no more gold and silver here. So the East India Company, after 1764, through Britain, takes taxes. They start collecting taxes. Just again, this is where the brutality begins. They start simply using brutality to force Indian people to give them taxes. And then they take this tax revenue, which they got through brutality, and use that to buy Indian goods. So this is simply called stealing. Someone says Prince Harry's hell-bent on taking down the monarch. You know, Harry wants to create his own monarchy, Angela. He's a not so obvious establishment of the British monarch. He's not really giving up much. We'll go more into that. So this is what's important to understand. So Indian goods still flow to Britain, but they're not paying for it in gold and silver anymore. They're paying using Indians' own tax revenue to buy their goods. This is what you call stealing. And then Britain uses these goods for their economy. They sell these goods on the open market and they buy timber, lumber, and they actually use this to fund wars all over the world because they're not paying anything for this. They're basically getting free Indian goods. I hope everyone's following me. So they basically start raping this is the first era of rape. They just take people's taxes and they use those taxes in rupees to buy Indian producers' goods, which go to England, and they use that to fuel their economy with those goods from the sale of those by timber and lumber to essentially start industrializing Britain and also use those goods to fuel wars. So the war in America was fueled by Indian goods when you really trace it back. And that's what Utsa Patnaik did. Now it gets even more interesting. One of the things we want to understand is something very important occurred in 1857. So remember, first they're trading Britain, then they start collecting taxes by just strong arming people. Then they move into becoming an occupying force in the Battle of Plassey in 1857 in Bengal. Now in Bengal is where some of the Indian revolutionaries were coming up, like the American Revolution. They were fighting back. They said, screw this. They were trying to fight back. And Britain basically said, we can't have this. So they literally take over Bengal with brutal oppression and they just seize control of Bengal. And economically, they do something quite interesting. And this diagram explains it. So what do? So remember, the East India Company through Britain is collecting taxes from people. Now there are people, the rest of the world over here, which also wants Indian goods. Remember, India was next to the United States up until 1947, the #2 exporter of goods next to the United States. That's how wealthy India was. Incredible wealth. So what happens here, as you can see here, is that the rest of the world wants Indian goods. But what Britain does is they say, you can't buy Indian goods directly. You have to go through us. We are the sole distributor of Indian goods to the world. So think about what I'm saying. If anyone's run businesses, imagine you getting an exclusive. Imagine you get the exclusive to sell iPhones in America, or you get the exclusive to sell iPhones in Africa. So Britain, through brutality to the rest of the world, says that you can only get access to Indian goods through us to the rest of the world. So Britain does massive just brutality in India. Just brutality. I'm talking about killing people, putting people in famine, massacring people, cutting off the thumbs of weavers. And we'll get into that in another video, who are producing Indian goods, and we can go on. But it was just through sheer brutality. Remember, Britain had nothing to trade with India. So what did they do? It was just pure brutality. And again, I want to emphasize, we're not talking about the British people. We're talking about the British elites. And so this diagram, this systems diagram, explains what they did. So the rest of the world wants Indian products. So what Britain does is, actually the arrow goes here, if you're not seeing it here, goes down. Britain tells the rest of the world to give them gold and silver. Britain takes that gold and silver into their banks, and they issue what are called council bills, like essentially a new currency. And these council bills were the only way you could buy Indian products. So let's say someone in Spain wanted to buy an Indian sari, or they wanted to buy rice from India or wheat. They would have to give Britain gold and silver. So now Britain is amassing incredible amounts of gold and silver, which is really worth something. And then Britain issues council bills to let's say the person in Spain. So let's say they give $100 worth of gold. Britain issues $100 worth of this paper. This paper is what the Spanish trader gives to the Indian producer. So look what's happening here. The Indian who's working his butt off making the product doesn't get gold and silver. He's getting something called a council bill. Okay. And in order to now for him to get the currency that he needs to trade, he takes that council bill over here and he goes to the tax office, which gives him rupees, which, by the way, these tax rupees were collected from taxes from the Indian producer. So he's basically getting his money back in currency wise, and he uses those rupees for his own economy. The Indian goods then flow to Britain, and then the British goods from Indian flow to the rest of the world. So the bottom line is, this is called, again, stealing to the order of two. You first of all tax the Indian people and you take their rupees. You don't give them gold and silver. You tell the rest of the world you can't send gold and silver to India. You got to give it to us. You issue a currency called council bills, which is what those countries have to, that's the only way you could buy Indian goods. And then the Indian producer who gets those Indian goods then has to go and to the local tax office and he gets rupees. Okay. So it's a complete way of ensuring that the balance sheet of India never gets strong. The balance sheet of Britain is growing. Okay. They're getting more and more and more gold, raping India, and India's balance sheet is going down and down. Meanwhile, they're exporting tons of product outside. So they're exporting wheat at the detriment to their own people. 10 million people die in India from famine because they're exporting wheat. Britain is getting the gold. Britain is amassing wealth. India's not getting anything out of the deal. Now, the question is, why didn't the Indian people fight back where they did? In Bengal, they fought back, but they were brutally suppressed. So it was pure brutality. That's the best way I can explain it. And because Britain had set up such a massive operation in India, and the other thing the British did well was they co-opted many of the Indian elites. Today, there's a system in India called the Indian Administrative Service. The British set up this entire administrative service of brown-skinned Indians to control all the other brown-skinned people. So when you look at this, I mean, look, I don't want to make a comparison, but there's so much we hear about, a guy called Adolf Hitler and the crimes that he did and Nazism and the brutality of the Holocaust, but he is clearly seen as an evildoer. And, but yet the Queen, when you look at this picture here, right, these people are celebrated. They're in the National Enquirer. They get public play every day. They get to resurrect themselves. They get to rebrand themselves. They have a massive PR machine. The obvious brutality, like of the Nazis, obviously is exposed, and it's called the Holocaust. But what occurred to India, 10 million people at minimum dying, 45 trillion in revenue stolen, and yet we celebrate royalty. You have the Queen's Jubilee. I mean, imagine if we celebrated, the Third Reich Jubilee. I think people would go really upset. So we have to really ask, why is it that we continue to celebrate the royalty? And I would argue it's the amount of money that was taken, the amount of public relations that's done. And we have to understand that the British Empire, the Queen, still presides over Parliament. She still meets with them. The monarchy is not dead. It is not just a titular thing. And if you look today, and I've talked about this in my earlier videos about the Atlantic Council, which comes out of Britain, they still control public policy all over the world. Public policy is controlled through the British Empire still to this day. And this is why I want to emphasize to everyone the analysis I just did, and I'll go back to it. When you really look at this, when you take a systems approach, you can take this knowledge and you're able to draw the systems diagram. You can see that there's no more gold going to India. So what Britain did very cleverly, if you look right up here, they literally created a local economy of paper to basically take money from the Indians and give them back their own money. Meanwhile, over here, they're taking money from the rest of the world and building the coffers of gold and silver in their bank accounts. And all of this was done through sheer brutality, brutality, brutality. Nothing else, just brutality. And then we're told, we get all these James Bond movies and the Knight movies, right? Chivalry. It's all bullshit. I'm sorry. You're looking at one of the very powerful public relations machines that was created out of the British Empire to always make them look as though they're doing some noble service to everyone else. Everyone else is a bunch of low class, bumpkins, and they are the elites. This is massive PR. So I encourage all of you to really think about this. And I encourage all of you to recognize there's been tons of papers and research done on this. The British trained Indian historians, very few of them will talk about this. Utsa Patnaik, a woman, brought this out. And I think what I've done here is to put it into a simple diagram so you can see this. The idea is to make this accessible. And that's why it's really, really important. I can't overemphasize that all of you, please learn systems thinking, learn the foundations of systems, do it for yourself, do it for your children. We've made it accessible to children all over the world. You can take the course, you can then become an educator, you can be a philanthropist, but we have to move beyond this left-right narrative. We got to move beyond the theater because both wings of the establishment just keep dividing all of us. And they do this because they bank on the fact that you will not take a systems approach. You will just look at, remember I talked about the systems approaches. You have the big elephant, and imagine being blind men, which is a reductionist, which is the opposite of a systems approach. You have blinders on and you touch the tusk and you think it's a spear, and someone else touches a tail and they think it's a brush. You don't even see the whole elephant. And that's the way those in power manipulate us. They make us see little pieces and they have us warring against each other. But when you take a systems approach like this, you see Britain is not so Great Britain. They're not Great Britain. They're not so Great Britain. It's really, really in 2022, if we're celebrating foolishly these things called a jubilee and even having things called a monarchy. And that's why even when you look at something like NATO, it is a vestige. It shouldn't even exist. It is a vestige of the British Empire when you really look at it. But until you take a systems approach, you will not have the tools to explain this to other people. So while I do this explanation, I really want all of you guys to learn this. I hope you guys go to vashiva.com/join, take advantage of the scholarship we're doing. That's where our movement is going. We want to educate people. The elections are selections, but if we educate enough people and people start understanding this and they learn how to take a systems approach, and then we can educate our children, particularly before they go to these things called colleges, then we may have an opportunity to significantly have impact. And we can do this, but it is through education.